PaxTube is probably the worst major channel on YouTube now that Zoomer Historian got himself banned. PaxTube spends most of his time watching anime and posting about Jewish people on Twitter, but when he's not blaming them for every single thing wrong on the entire planet, he posts propaganda slop videos which get hundreds of thousands of views. I've covered a video of his before, but I figure it's time to debunk his lunatic claims about the Russo-Ukrainian war. This is what, why, how, and that's what the video's about. If you want to support this channel and get early access to future videos, you can do so on patreon.com/whatwhyhow. Okay, let's debunk PaxTube's video, Who's Truly to Blame for the Russia-Ukraine War? The full story. PaxTube has another video about Ukraine, so if you want me to debunk that one, subscribe and share this video. If it gets a bunch of views, I'll make that one. Okay, while PaxTube doesn't say it in the beginning of this video, his thesis is that America started the Russia-Ukraine war, somehow, by being real mean to Russia. Most of his video, of course, is spent painting a victim narrative, but I want to explain my own thesis. Russia started the Russia-Ukraine war by invading Ukraine. Countries are responsible for their own actions. There's this bizarre thing that radical people cling to where only the United States has agency in the world in their view. Now that makes sense, for tiny countries like Cuba, which the United States bullies, but we're talking about Russia in this circumstance, which arguably has the second strongest military in the world. Russia made a decision, under its own volition, to start the largest land war in Europe since World War II. There were many times when it could have simply not done that. A lot of pro-Russia, far-right people in America make the argument that the United States should befriend Russia to secure an ally against China, which will soon be a larger threat. But the fact of the matter is, Russia never stopped antagonizing America and Europe, as we'll see over the course of the video. But let's let PaxTube get a word in. He opens his video by saying,
"The Russia-Ukraine war is perhaps the most geopolitically important event in our lifetimes. Yet, it's also one of the most misunderstood. While many people today think this war began out of nowhere in 2022, the true roots of this conflict go back decades. And the causes of the conflict involve much more than just Ukraine and Russia. America, the United Kingdom, and NATO have their fingerprints all over this war from start to finish. Before and since 2022, NATO governments led by the United States have poured hundreds of billions of dollars into the Ukrainian government. As of today, we can say that this is a true proxy war between Russia and the leading members of NATO." Those aren't just my words. The new US Secretary of State Marco Rubio admitted this.
Now, I know this is just the beginning of his video, but already PaxTube is confusing basic cause and effect. The fact that the United States supports Ukraine does not mean the war was caused by America, any more than the fact that the United States gave aid to the Soviet Union during World War II means World War II was started by America, but somehow I think PaxTube might believe that too. Second, and this is something I see on both the far right and the far left, just because America's decisions to provide aid to Ukraine might be based in cynical, realist, geopolitical competition with Russia does not mean it's bad to do so. First, countries don't really make geopolitical decisions based on morality, but rather what is best for themselves. To expect any country to do anything for purely selfless reasons is irrational. If you want to bring morality into the equation, which maybe you should as human beings, then you should look for moral results rather than moral motivations. What I mean by that is, does America's aid to Ukraine produce moral results? Well, considering the fact that Ukraine is, by all possible, reasonable interpretations, defending itself from a hostile invasion, I think yeah, helping Ukraine does produce a moral result. The truth is, a lot of far right and far left people in the West oppose the United States helping Ukraine really only because they dislike the United States, either because it is a source of moral degeneracy according to people on the far right, or the core of capitalist imperialism for people on the far left. If you know my channel, you know which one I agree with more. But even if either of those are completely true, they're irrelevant to the question of Ukraine's right to defend itself from a hostile invasion. The reason I bring up the moral question is because this video by PaxTube, despite ostensibly being about geopolitics and history, is actually about morality. How mean and evil and bad America is to Russia. How poor old Russia was being bullied by America. How the evil international banksters are destroying Western civilization with liberalism, and how Russia had no choice but to defend itself by launching an aggressive invasion and causing the largest, bloodiest conflict on European soil since the last time a nationalist dictatorship wanted to conquer its neighbors. But you know what? We'll talk in more detail about why Russia's pity story is completely false soon. But next, PaxTube says the origins of this conflict go all the way back to the end of the Cold War. He spins the usual yarn of a new Russia spurned by a cruel America. And of course, he does the usual PaxTube shtick.
In 1992, the Russian Jewish politician Yegor Gadar became prime minister. He pledged to improve the Russian economy through a mass economic privatization policy known as shock therapy. Russia's state industries and social programs were to be rapidly liquidated and sold to the highest bidder. This plan was endorsed by the International Monetary Fund, the US Treasury, and the Clinton administration.
Now, I'm not going to spend a bunch of time going over Russia's economy in the 1990s because it is irrelevant to both the moral and geopolitical question of modern-day Ukraine. I just want to point out that PaxTube, who believes Jewish people control the world, made sure to point out that this guy was Jewish. But he was actually partially Jewish. Igor Gadar, who led the privatization program, had a Jewish mother. This article says Vice President Alexander Rutskoy also had a Jewish mother. Oh my god! But Rutskoy was a vocal critic of privatization, almost as if Jewish people are not a monolith. Next, PaxTube begins the inevitable screed on NATO expansion.
By the late 1990s, a new rift emerged in American-Russian relations: NATO's eastward expansion. Starting in 1999, Eastern European countries such as Poland, the Czech Republic, and Hungary all joined the NATO alliance. This was widely seen in Russia as America reneging on its promise not to expand NATO eastward. This promise was made during negotiations in 1990 over the reunification of Germany. Transcripts of the meetings in Moscow at the time show that US Secretary of State James Baker told Soviet leader Mikhail Gorbachev that there would be ironclad guarantees that NATO wouldn't expand 1 inch eastward. The article, NATO Expansion, What Gorbachev Heard, from George Washington University says, US Secretary of State James Baker's famous not 1 inch eastward assurance about NATO's expansion was part of a cascade of assurances about Soviet security given by Western leaders to Gorbachev. Discussions of NATO in the context of German unification negotiations in 1990 were not at all narrowly limited to the status of East German territory, and subsequent Soviet and Russian complaints about being misled about NATO expansion were founded in written contemporaneous memcons and telcons at the highest levels. To put it simply, American and NATO officials did tell Soviet officials that NATO wouldn't expand eastward. However, when America was in a stronger position, this promise disappeared. NATO apologists often defend these actions by claiming that there was never an agreement in writing on NATO's expansion eastward, but this ignores the fact that America had deliberately misled and taken advantage of Russia's trust, acting in bad faith and damaging American-Russian relations. There's a saying that you're only as good as your word, and America had broken theirs.
Okay, this is another airing of grievances by PaxTube, which is again irrelevant to the direct issue of Russia's 2022 invasion of Ukraine, since Ukraine has nothing to do with any promise made by the US Secretary of State to the Soviet Union in 1990. But also, PaxTube misrepresents that promise, which wasn't actually a promise. He insists that Baker's assurances weren't just about East Germany, citing an article that doesn't explain how that's the case. So let's actually, use our brains, unlike PaxTube, and look at the conversation. According to a Gorbachev Foundation transcript of the February 9, 1990 conversation, Secretary of State Baker said, "NATO is the mechanism for securing US presence in Europe. If NATO is liquidated, there will be no such mechanism in Europe. We understand that not only for the Soviet Union, but for other European countries as well, it is important to have guarantees that if the United States keeps its presence in Germany within the framework of NATO, not an inch of NATO's present military jurisdiction will spread in an eastern direction. We believe that consultations and discussions within the framework of the 2+4 mechanism should guarantee that Germany's unification will not lead to NATO's military organization spreading to the east." Later on, Baker said, "I want to ask you a question, and you need not answer it right now. Supposing unification takes place, what would you prefer? A united Germany outside of NATO, absolutely independent and without American troops, or a united Germany keeping its connections with NATO, but with the guarantee that NATO's jurisprudence or troops will not spread east of the present boundary?" Gorbachev then said, "We will think everything over. We intend to discuss all these questions in depth at the leadership level. It goes without saying that a broadening of the NATO zone is not acceptable." Baker then said, "We agree with that." Am I crazy? Am I a lunatic? This is not a promise. It's not even really an assurance. Baker is obviously making a suggestion to get the Soviet Union to agree to German unification. He's talking about a hypothetical situation, hence the ifs, the shoulds, and the woulds. Here's what historian Mary Elisa wrote in her book, Not 1 Inch. Baker and his aides and supporters would point to the hypothetical phrasing and lack of any written agreement afterward as a sign that the secretary had only been test driving one potential option of many. Obviously, Russia is going to grasp at whatever straws it can pluck and run with them to criticize its geopolitical rivals. But we, regular people, who are not in charge of the Russian State Department, can look at this text and use our brains to interpret the reality of the situation, which is that the United States did not make any promise to Gorbachev not to welcome new countries into NATO. But you know what? Let's look even deeper. Let's look at the topic of the conversation. The specific circumstances of the statement become even more restricted if we do that. Here's what Baker said minutes beforehand. On March 18th, the people of East Germany will vote in their elections. The overwhelming majority will be for unification, and they will elect leaders who support the idea of German unification. Soon the two German states will start discussing on the internal aspects of unification, such questions as the unification of the governments, parliaments, a common capital, common currency, and economic union. All of this is going on de facto. Then the conversation continues back and forth, continuously about the status of Germany, specifically East Germany. In case you missed the details, they're discussing whether NATO military forces would relocate eastward within a reunified Germany, because at this point, the Warsaw Pact still existed, as did the Soviet Union. They're not discussing whether other countries such as Poland or Ukraine or Estonia, the latter of two which were not countries yet, would join NATO. But you don't have to trust me, I'm a biased lib YouTuber. Gorbachev himself said the US did not violate any agreement. The interviewer, who seems to be more aggressive on this issue than him, said, "One of the key issues that has arisen in connection with the events in Ukraine is NATO expansion into the east. Did you get the feeling that your Western partners lied to you when they were developing their future plans in Eastern Europe? Why didn't you insist that the promises made to you, particularly US Secretary of State James Baker's promise that NATO would not expand into the east, be legally encoded?" I will quote Baker, "NATO will not move 1 inch further east." In response, Mikhail Gorbachev, the person who this promise was allegedly made to, said, "The topic of NATO expansion was not discussed at all, and it wasn't brought up in those years. I say this with full responsibility. Not a single Eastern European country raised the issue, not even after the Warsaw Pact ceased to exist in 1991. Western leaders didn't bring it up either. Another issue we brought up was discussed, making sure that NATO's military structures would not advance and that additional armed forces from the alliance would not be deployed on the territory of the then GDR, that's East Germany, after German reunification." Baker's statement mentioned in your question was made in that context. Kohl and Genscher talked about it. Everything that could have been and needed to be done to solidify that political obligation was done and fulfilled. The agreement on a final settlement with Germany said that no new military structures would be created in the eastern part of the country. No additional troops would be deployed. No weapons of mass destruction would be placed there. It has been observed all these years. So don't betray Gorbachev and the then Soviet authorities as naive people who were wrapped around the West's finger. If there was naivete, it was later when the issue arose. Russia at first did not object. The decision for the US and its allies to expand NATO into the East was decisively made in 1993. I call this a big mistake from the very beginning. It was definitely a violation of the spirit of the statements and assurances made to us in 1990. With regards to Germany, they were legally enshrined and are being observed. So Gorbachev himself said that the United States, through Baker, did not make any promise to not welcome new countries to NATO. Instead, Baker made an assurance that NATO would not deploy new military forces to eastern Germany after reunification. Anything else, according to Gorbachev, was a violation of the spirit of the assurance, not a violation of any actual promise. But here's another thing. Even if President George H.W. Bush himself promised he'd prohibit any Eastern European country from joining NATO, which he didn't, it doesn't matter anymore. All the way back in 1997, Russia signed the Russia-NATO Founding Act. Check out this section, which Russia actually signed and agreed to. It's a treaty. NATO and Russia will base their relations on a shared commitment to the following principles: respect for sovereignty, independence, and territorial integrity of all states, and their inherent right to choose the means to ensure their own security, the inviolability of borders, and people's right of self-determination. So Russia can make all the complaints it wants, but back in 1997, it explicitly agreed to recognize the right of all countries to choose the means to ensure their own security, such as, for example, joining NATO. If we care about treaties and agreements, which PaxTube is only pretending to care about, then surely this treaty signed by Russia supersedes any vocal hypothetical contingent condition made in passing by the US Secretary of State way back in 1990 to the leader of the Soviet Union, a dead country. Anyways, PaxTube next starts talking about, believe it or not, the Yugoslav wars.
Russia may have taken the expansion of NATO more lightly if it weren't for another major event in 1999, the NATO bombing of Yugoslavia. This was the first time NATO used military force without the approval of the UN Security Council, and thus international legal approval. This showed that NATO would operate not only as a defensive alliance, but an offensive alliance that had no problem bombing sovereign states it disapproved of. Russia observed all of this and never forgot it. Even the famous Russian writer Alexander Solzhenitsyn decried the action, saying, "NATO has proclaimed to the whole world, might is right. Those who are strong are always right." He added that it was the destruction of a beautiful country in full view of humanity, while civilized governments applaud this. Not only Russia, but many countries across the world opposed these actions by NATO. It was a serious departure from what NATO claimed to stand for, and people would not quickly forget this.
Wow, NATO was definitely evil, randomly bombing poor old Serbia just because it disapproved of Serbia. Can we have just a little bit more context, PaxTube? Was Yugoslavia doing anything at all before March 24th, 1999? Perhaps maybe Yugoslavia abolished Kosovo's autonomy, imposed a brutal occupation on Kosovo, destroyed villages and massacred civilians, driving hundreds of thousands of people to flee their homes, and was poised to launch even greater operations against Kosovo. This is what I mean. PaxTube is mixing morality and geopolitics. You can make the geopolitical argument that NATO's intervention in Kosovo harmed relations with Moscow and made Moscow real sad. But PaxTube also adds in the bit about might makes right, which he believes in anyways, and how uncivilized the West is actually. The absolute truth of the matter is, NATO intervention, woe to Serbia, saved lives by stopping a budding genocide and forcing Yugoslavia to withdraw from Kosovo. PaxTube's weird pity party for Serbia is completely morally bankrupt. I don't care if it made Slobodan Milosevic sad that America intervened. The United States and other powerful countries have a moral responsibility to protect civilians from murder. PaxTube can rant about Yugoslavia's sovereignty as much as he wants, but if a government begins to massacre its own civilians, it loses sovereignty in my book. Anyways, PaxTube next needs a hero to answer the villainous United States. Enter Vladimir Putin.
As Russia was reeling from the 1990s chaos, in the year 2000, Vladimir Putin became president of the country. Putin began implementing policies very different from his predecessor Yeltsin. He led economic and criminal reforms, including a crackdown against many of the worst oligarchs who had looted Russia in the 90s. Boris Berezovsky, who had bought up Russian media outlets during shock therapy and bragged about how his clique of 7 bankers controlled over 50% of the economy, fled Russia to Britain in fear of a criminal investigation. Yegor Gadar, the prime minister architect of shock therapy, fled Russia to Ireland and later Ukraine.
The fact of the matter is, of course, Russian living standards, objectively speaking, improved from the 1990s during the 2000s. That's good for Russians. PaxTube also celebrates Putin for going after some oligarchs, which is good, but then thereafter completely drops the issue of corruption in Russia, as if Vladimir Putin cured the nation of all corruption. He hasn't, actually. In fact, Putin simply swapped one basket of oligarchs, allied with Yeltsin, with a new basket of oligarchs, allied, of course, with himself. And that's just oligarchs, of course. Corruption, in general, is still endemic throughout Russia. Russia's top prosecutor said in 2024 that 30,000 officials were caught and disciplined for bribery and other acts of corruption. And those are just the ones they caught. Now you might say, wow, Putin's really clearing out corruption. Except of those 30,000, only 500 were fired. PaxTube next goes over how, in the 2000s, NATO kept expanding, and the US kept antagonizing Russia, despite poor old Russia's innocent quest for friendship with the West.
Despite all of this, when 9/11 happened, Russia still declared full support to the US in fighting terrorism. America didn't seem to care about this gesture of goodwill. In 2004, NATO underwent another round of eastward expansion, this time taking in the Baltic states, Romania, and several other Eastern European countries. In 2005, President Putin complained to American diplomats, "You Americans need to listen more. You can't have everything your way anymore. We can have effective relations, but not just on your terms."
Again, PaxTube depicts Russia as an innocent victim in all of this. If you believe for a second that Russia would not do the same exact thing if given the chance to, I have an oceanside property in Belarus to sell you. Estonia, Romania, Slovakia, and so on are all sovereign countries with the right, as Russia agreed, to determine their own means of self-defense. The moral question is indisputable. Russia deserved absolutely zero say in whether those countries, sovereign nations all, joined NATO or not. Now, there is a debate to be had about the geopolitical intelligence of NATO expansion from America's POV, whether it was wise for America to do so. From my perspective, there's a good reason the only countries Russia seems to start wars with are those outside of NATO. If Estonia never joined NATO, are we pretending Russia wouldn't have found an excuse to invade them too? Undoubtedly, joining NATO and the European Union have been definitely beneficial to those countries in Eastern Europe that have been lucky enough to do so. It's also beneficial for the United States. In a definite disappointment to PaxTube, the United States defeated Germany and Japan and has become the world's global superpower. Our interests, like it or not, don't just stop at the Jersey Shore. We have gigantic military bases in Europe. We have extensive trade with Europe. And those interests are inevitably opposed to any sort of resurgent Russian empire. It was inevitable that America and Western Europe would expand to fill the vacuum left behind by the fall of the Soviet Union. And to expect the West to willingly weaken itself to avoid hurting Russia's feelings is a standard nobody has held any other country to in human history. If you want to say it was against America's interest to do so, where is the evidence? Show me some proof. Russia is stuck fighting a land war on its own borders. while the United States, last I checked, is still the strongest country in the world, despite repeatedly making stupid mistakes in other areas. But even then, even though the US did not really have to, we still sought cooperation with Russia, despite what PaxTube says, including a major push in May 2002, which saw a Russo-American Strategic Arms Reduction Treaty and the creation of the NATO-Russia Council. Russia had a chance to cooperate with the West. If Putin took a different path in the 2000s and 2010s, if he actually seriously addressed corruption and sought to cooperate with the US and EU over their potential mutual rival maybe, China, then I think it would be plausible for Russia to be an EU and NATO member state by 2026. This is 20 years of change, so it's definitely possible. Other former communist countries are, so why not? Vladimir Putin instead chose the path of confrontation, so the ship has sailed and it's not looping back around until Vladimir Putin is dead. Next, PaxTube says,
throughout the 2000s, a new trend began to emerge in Eastern Europe, America backing so-called color revolutions across the region. One of the first of these color revolutions occurred in none other than Ukraine in 2004. This revolution was known as the Orange Revolution. Its goal was to topple the pro-Russian government at the time and install a pro-NATO one. Does that sound familiar? Sources like The Guardian note in 2004, the campaign is an American creation, a sophisticated and brilliantly conceived exercise in Western branding and mass marketing that, in 4 countries in 4 years, has been used to try to salvage rigged elections and topple unsavory regimes. The Guardian was writing in favor of these color revolutions, but in doing so admitted that they're creations of the American government and are used to topple governments it doesn't like. Nevertheless, in 2004 the Orange Revolution in Ukraine succeeded in bringing the pro-NATO Viktor Yushchenko to power for 5 years. The success of the Orange Revolution set the precedent for future regime change in Ukraine.
Here it should be pretty obvious that PaxTube is minimizing and delegitimizing the 2004 revolution in Ukraine as nothing more than an American operation solely based on an article from The Guardian. But at the same time, the only available stock footage online is of a massive crowd of Ukrainians, which should suggest that, even if PaxTube's argument is correct, clearly many Ukrainians wanted to be closer to the West than Russia. Also, PaxTube completely neglects to explain what specifically happens, and instead uses such terms as topple and install to describe what happened. In actuality, the Orange Revolution was a political revolution. It was a mass protest movement against corruption, against a fraudulent election. Ukraine, through fully legal means, held a revote afterward, and an opposition candidate, Viktor Yushchenko, won power for a few years. The government was not toppled, it lost power in an election. Here's a quote from a study on the causes of the Orange Revolution. According to our own research and that of other experts, authorities and state institutions, which are quite often unpopular in many countries, seriously lacked public trust and were not supported in Ukraine. The tape scandal of 2001, a further political crisis which was connected with the tragic death of Georgy Gongadze, and the accusation that the nation's highest-ranking officials were connected to it, seemed to undermine the rest of the presidential power's legitimacy. According to the survey in 2005, almost 40% of the respondents evaluated Leonid Kuchma's work as president of Ukraine with the lowest possible mark. It is also obvious that the hand-rule personalized government, based not on the rule of law, but on ponyatia, an informal, unregulated way of government, was inefficient and did not satisfy the majority of Ukrainians. When asked the reasons for the Orange Revolution, 42% of Ukrainians polled said it was a protest against the authorities. 30% believed it was to improve their own social economic position, and so on. Only 5% believed it was a geopolitical struggle between the West and Russia. Since Ukrainians and Ukrainians alone were the sole necessary ingredient of the Orange Revolution, surely their own motivations are most relevant in determining why the revolution happened. Next, PaxTube brings up Georgia, not the state but the country.
But that wasn't all. In 2003, the Georgian government was also overthrown by a US-backed color revolution known as the Rose Revolution. Like in Ukraine, it threw out a government that was friendly to Russia and installed one that was pro-NATO. Between 2003 and 2008, the US began arming and training Georgia to engage in war with Russia.
What's the point of all of this?
Just to train them in the fundamentals of offense and defense.
Big overall question, why? Why is the US actually doing this?
Just to, I don't know why.
Allow me to answer that question for him. They were training the Georgian military to attack Russia. Tensions came to a head in 2008 when the Georgian government invaded the pro-Russian separatist region of South Ossetia. Georgian forces attacked Russian peacekeepers, starting a war which Russia decisively won in 5 days. NATO apologists today call this a Russian attack, but the EU investigation into the conflict later concluded that the America-backed Georgian government had started the war. Even the EU concluded that Russia didn't start this conflict. Reuters reported in 2009, Georgia started a war with Russia, a report supported by the EU.
So PaxTube just reads the headline of an article, but if he bothered to look down in the first paragraph, he'd see an independent report blamed Georgia on Wednesday for starting last year's 5-day war with Russia, but said Moscow's military response went beyond reasonable limits and violated international law. The report commissioned by the EU said both sides had broken international humanitarian laws and found evidence of ethnic cleansing against ethnic Georgians during Russia's intervention in the rebel province of South Ossetia. I wonder why PaxTube didn't read that. Maybe because it doesn't cast Russia as a perpetual victim. Here's what else the article that PaxTube cites says. In the mission's view, it was Georgia which triggered off the war when it attacked Skinvali in South Ossetia with heavy artillery on the night of 7 to 8 August 2008, said Swiss diplomat Heidi Tagliavani, who led the investigation. The report said the war followed tensions and provocations by Russia, but Tagliavani said none of the explanations given by the Georgian authorities in order to provide some form of legal justification for the attack lended a valid explanation. So it's certainly not as black and white as PaxTube says. Does Russia bear any responsibility at all for hurting its relations with the United States by invading Georgia and supporting an ethnic cleansing of Georgians, per the report that PaxTube cites? Can Russia do anything to no longer be a victim, or would it still be a victim even if it nuked all of Georgia? And of course, the Tagliavani report had its critics. Just because something was sponsored by the EU doesn't mean we should take it as absolute truth no matter what. Also, Tagliavani's statements, as quoted by Reuters, are much more definitive than the actual report. The actual report says any explanation of the origins of the conflict cannot focus solely on the artillery attack on Skinvali on the night of 7 to 8 August and on what then developed into the questionable Georgian offensive in South Ossetia and the Russian military action. The evaluation also has to cover the run-up to the war during the years before and the mounting tensions in the months and weeks immediately preceding the outbreak of hostilities. There is no way to assign overall responsibility for the conflict to one side. Anyways, next PaxTube gets onto Obama and how Obama was the same old evil American president who supported such terrible things as the Arab Spring and the downfall of dictator Muammar Gaddafi. Here's what he says.
From 2008 to 2014, America and other NATO countries such as the UK and France continued backing color revolutions toppling governments across the world. Some of the most famous of these were the so-called Arab Spring, where governments in the Arab world were overthrown left and right. One such example was Libya under Muammar Gaddafi, a Russian ally. The rebels opposing him were directly backed by NATO air support, which bombed and sabotaged Libyan state troops. The US and UK governments had long hated Gaddafi and took their chance to kill him. Gaddafi ended up brutally murdered in the streets, and his country descended into complete chaos which continues to present day. The entire country of Libya was destroyed by NATO, again a supposedly defensive alliance.
I think there's some sort of weird cognitohazard that has infected the brains of far-right and far-left people where they believe the United States is responsible for literally every single thing that happens in the world. The fact of the matter is, the Arab Spring had infinitely more to do with the people of Arab nations themselves than the United States. For example, let's look at Egypt, whose 2011 revolution took out President Hosni Mubarak. Was the United States trying for years to topple Mubarak? Was the CIA secretly involved, planting seeds of revolution against Mubarak? No, Mubarak was an ally of America. Here's what a 2011 Guardian article says. Secret U.S. embassy cables sent from Cairo in the past 2 years reveal that the Obama administration wanted to maintain a close political and military relationship with the Egyptian president, Hosni Mubarak, who is now facing a popular uprising. This is a quote now from a source. "The tangible benefits of our military-to-military relationship are clear. Egypt remains at peace with Israel, and the U.S. military enjoys priority access to the Suez Canal and Egyptian airspace." The Obama administration's decisions were always, instead, lagging behind events on the ground. In his book, A Promised Land, Obama himself wrote, "This was precisely the scenario my presidential study directive sought to avoid." I kind of did Bill Clinton there for a second. Sorry. "This was precisely the scenario my presidential study directive had sought to avoid. The U.S. government suddenly caught between a repressive but reliable ally and a population insistent on change, voicing the democratic aspirations we claimed to stand for." As events on the ground escalated, the Obama administration first called for Mubarak to implement reforms, then called for Mubarak to step down, always dragged along by the escalation of the revolution. My point with this whole Egyptian escapade is to show that the United States, while being the most powerful country in the world, is not omnipotent. It cannot just manifest mass revolutions in dozens of countries, and in many cases the US was scrambling to keep up with events on the ground outside of its control. So let's now look at Libya, right next door to Egypt. PaxTube says that the US and UK governments had long hated Gaddafi. Why? Maybe because Gaddafi personally ordered the bombing of Pan Am Flight 103, which killed 270 civilians, according to Libya's own former justice minister. If Israel did that, what would President PaxTube's response be to that? Gaddafi was an insane dictator. He called for global jihad against, of all countries, Switzerland, probably because Switzerland briefly arrested his son for beating 2 servants at a luxury hotel. He said, "The masses of Muslims must go to all airports in the Islamic world and prevent any Swiss plane landing, to all harbors and prevent any Swiss ships docking, inspect all shops and markets to stop any Swiss goods from being sold." Believe it or not, Libyans eventually got tired of having a brutal, insane dictator. Libyans rose up in a mass revolution, especially concentrated in the neglected eastern areas of the country. Just based on pure logistics, the United States could not have instigated this mass revolution. Gaddafi, predictably, ordered the massacre of protesters. Government forces killed hundreds and hundreds of people. Gaddafi pledged to cleanse the rebellious city of Benghazi, tracking down his enemies alley by alley, road by road. The United Nations Security Council, including Russia and China, unanimously condemned Gaddafi's use of force against civilians and imposed sanctions on Libya in Resolution 1970. Countries across the world, including many Arab countries, called for the Security Council to impose a no-fly zone over Libya to prevent Gaddafi from launching airstrikes against his own people. But violence continued to escalate, with Gaddafi's forces poised to strike the rebel-held city of Benghazi, ignoring Resolution 1970. On March 17th, the Security Council passed a new resolution, 1973. It authorized and called for UN member states to take all necessary measures to protect civilians and civilian-populated areas under threat of attack, and imposed a no-fly zone for the Libyan Air Force over the country. Resolution 1973 saw several major countries abstain, including China and Russia, but notably, neither of those countries used their veto power to block the resolution. Why do you think they might have done that? They could have vetoed it, but they didn't. While PaxTube plays an image of a destroyed city and says NATO destroyed Libya, NATO's campaign against Gaddafi was targeted against the military, which was poised to massacre thousands of civilians. As a report produced by the Human Rights Council says, the North Atlantic Treaty Organization conducted a highly precise campaign with a demonstrable determination to avoid civilian casualties. On limited occasions, the Commission confirmed civilian casualties and found targets that showed no evidence of military utility. The Commission was unable to draw conclusions in such instances on the basis of the information provided by NATO and recommends further investigations. Later it says, the Commission documented 5 airstrikes, leading to a total of 60 civilians killed and 55 injured. Now, 60 civilians is a lot of people in an objective sense, and other estimations have the number being a bit higher. But for a gigantic military operation, that is a remarkably low level of civilian casualties. Second, people don't know much about what happened afterwards. Libya did not immediately shatter apart. They had a free national election. Libya's second in history in 2012. The civil war began in 2014. Libya is constantly retroactively cited as the greatest Obama blunder. But what should America have done? Should we have sat on the sidelines and just watched as Gaddafi massacred thousands of people, driving Libya into a Syria-style civil war anyways? Again, strong countries have a responsibility to protect civilians from tyrannical governments. From my point of view and the point of view of Obama himself, the greater mistake was failing to do more to stabilize Libya after the revolution. But again, the United States is not omnipotent. It's real easy for countries or people to sit on the sidelines and point fingers of blame at countries that actually try to do a good thing. Next, PaxTube says a bit about Syria, blaming America for supporting rebels, but since President Assad was another brutal dictator, the same arguments apply from Libya, except of course the United States conducted much smaller operations against Assad. Again, America can't just bring millions of people out into the street. The people in these countries themselves rose up in revolution against unpopular, brutal dictators. Let's go to the next section.
Another rift emerged between Russia and America-aligned countries. Large cultural differences grew on issues such as family values, Christianity, and LGBT. Between 2000 and 2020, Western countries liberalized social laws across the board. Gay marriage, gay adoption, you name it. America also became the pornography capital of the world, producing more porn than any other country and exporting it. Mass immigration brought America from a 90% white country in the 1950s to a 60% white country in 2020. And today, America is projected to be majority non-white in the 2040s. In Russia, the story was incredibly different. Russia strengthened laws against LGBT, most famously its landmark 2012 anti-gay propaganda law. This law effectively made gay activism illegal in Russia. LGBT adoption was banned, as well as the production and distribution of pornography. Abortion became more restricted, and the state encouraged ethnic Russians to have more children to protect their demographic future. In 20 years, Russia will still be a racially European country, unlike America. Furthermore, Christian identification in Russia actually grew, from 30% in the Soviet era to over 70% by 2014. Many Western countries followed in the same boat as America, becoming pro-gay, pro-mass immigration, and hostile to traditional understandings of religion. The world stage as we know it was set, and it would lead to the Russia-Ukraine war.
Alright, so we can see here that PaxTube goes off on a rant about social issues that have absolutely zero to do with Russia's decision to invade Ukraine. Obviously, PaxTube is a conservative, he's very conservative, so of course he loves Russia. He also probably doesn't mind that Russia is the wife-beating capital of the world. And while PaxTube is really concerned about the Islamicization of the West, from his point of view, his condemnation should be even greater for Russia. I mean, just looking at the data, Russia specifically lifted its ban on Chechens from serving in the Russian military just so they could beat skulls in Ukraine. While America is 2% Muslim and France is about 10% Muslim, 10 to 15% of Russia is Muslim. This Muslim population is growing faster than the non-Muslim population, so just as future predictions say a large percentage of France will be Muslim by 2050, the same exact trend holds for Russia. But PaxTube doesn't bring that up ever. Also, while PaxTube declares that 70% of Russians identify as Christians back in 2014, a much smaller percentage of Russians actually practice their religion. As of 2008, for example, around 7% of Russians attend religious service at least once a month, which is smaller than it was back in 1998 before Putin. But of course, I'm not a radical conservative. These issues don't have much to do with Russia's decision to invade Ukraine. They're just PaxTube's favorite pet issues, so he managed to plug them into a completely irrelevant video. Next, PaxTube, nearly 20 minutes into the video, finally gets to the part, NATO in Ukraine.
In 2008, the U.S. ambassador to Russia, William J. Burns, wrote to Secretary of State Condoleezza Rice, "Ukrainian entry into NATO is the brightest of all red lines for the Russian elite, not just Putin. In more than 2.5 years of conversations with key Russian players, from knuckle-draggers in the dark recesses of the Kremlin to Putin's sharpest liberal critics, I have yet to find anyone who views Ukraine and NATO as anything other than a direct challenge to Russian interests." American officials were fully aware that Ukraine joining NATO was something that no one in the Russian leadership could tolerate, whether they be in Putin's circle or his liberal critics. Nevertheless, in 2014, the US government under Barack Obama backed the infamous Maidan revolution in Ukraine. This revolution overthrew the Russia-friendly government of Viktor Yanukovych and replaced it with a pro-NATO government. John McCain, Victoria Nuland, and other American government officials were literally on the ground in Ukraine cheering as it happened. They didn't even bother to hide their involvement.
I'll say it once again. The United States did not instigate this mass movement either. What specifically does PaxTube think America did? Did America secretly pay hundreds of thousands of people to protest against their government, and all of them kept that a secret? While PaxTube spends a whole section of his video on how woke America is, he doesn't even explain why the 2014 revolution happened in Ukraine. President Viktor Yanukovych, who lost the 2004 election, finally became president in 2010. Both Yanukovych and an overwhelming majority of the Ukrainian legislature sought closer ties with the European Union, which is very understandable for a country to do. But Russia intervened and placed immense economic pressure on Ukraine in 2013. So Yanukovych made a very unpopular decision and walked away from the association agreement. Understandably, many Ukrainians were pissed off about this. As the protest grew, so too did the government's crackdown against the protesters. Like the 2004 revolution, when surveyed, Ukrainians primarily answered their revolution was not about America or Russia. This article from the Kiev Post cites a survey of over 1,000 protesters that says 70% of respondents said the main reason why they came to the protest was because of the November 30th beating of demonstrators by police. Nearly 54% said they are protesting because Yanukovych didn't sign the association agreement with the European Union. Why is it bad for the United States to support the 2014 revolution in Ukraine? On a purely moral level, people have the right to change their government if they want. If Russia is upset about what government Ukrainians choose, then maybe Russia should try to offer Ukrainians something of value, instead of blackmailing them and then invading when it doesn't work out. PaxTube next calls the revolution a coup. But who exactly overthrew Yanukovych? Was it the Ukrainian military? Was it the CIA? No. Ukraine's parliament, elected by the people, voted by a vast majority that Yanukovych had abandoned the presidency by fleeing all of this. So it wasn't a coup, it was a revolution, led by the people themselves. Here's what PaxTube says next.
Just a week before the coup occurred, there was a leaked phone call of Victoria Nuland speaking about the Ukrainian opposition as if she controlled it. When asked about how the EU would react to all of this, she replied, "F the EU."
So that would be great, I think, to help glue this thing and have the UN help glue it. And, F the EU.
No, exactly. And I think we've got to do something to make it stick together, because you can be pretty sure that if it does start to gain altitude, the Russians will be working behind the scenes to try to torpedo it.
That's how much she cared about European interests. And people listening to this in the EU area should seriously consider that.
PaxTube isn't even good at communicating the pro-Russian talking points. He doesn't explain what this recording is even about. He doesn't explain why they're saying F the EU. He doesn't even explain why we should be angry about it. Oh my god, an American diplomat said something rude about the EU? My goodness. No, Victoria Nuland did not control the Ukrainian opposition, and sometimes adults use mean words. PaxTube says,
in response to this coup, the ethnic Russian regions of Ukraine such as Donetsk, Luhansk, and Crimea immediately rose up in rebellion against the new Ukrainian government.
Why does he say Crimea? Is this the first time he said the word? Has he never heard it said aloud? It's not even like he's trying to do a linguistically correct Russian pronunciation either. He's even further away from the Russian pronunciation.
Историю Крыма. Знать, что значило и значит Россия для Крыма и Крым для России. В Крыму буквально все пронизано нашей общей историей и гордостью.
Anyways.
Kiev declared them all to be terrorists and launched what it called an anti-terrorist operation to destroy them. Russia, seeing the opportunity, gladly stepped in to back these separatists and annexed Crimea. Crimea had long been disputed between Russia and Ukraine, and this was seen by Moscow as the chance to settle the issue once and for all. A war began between the Russian-backed separatists of eastern Ukraine and the US-UK-backed government in Kiev.
I don't know why I'm supposed to be real upset that Ukraine declared secessionists to be terrorists. Russia did the same exact thing with its separatist movements, and PaxTube took a friendly tone earlier in the video. Also, Crimea has not long been disputed between Russia and Ukraine. Since the fall of the Soviet Union, Russia recognized Ukraine's borders several times over, including Crimea, most notably in the 1994 Budapest Memorandum. Ukraine agreed to transfer Soviet-era nuclear weapons to Russia, while Russia specifically agreed to refrain from the threat or use of force against the territorial integrity or political independence of Ukraine. While PaxTube has a whole section crying about America breaking a promise that never existed, Russia blatantly broke this treaty by invading Ukraine and annexing Crimea. Also, the way he said Crimea is now stuck in my head, so whenever I open my mouth to pronounce the word, I want to say Crimea. It's Crimea, of course. Next, PaxTube says,
The New York Times reported plainly in 2024, the partnership between the CIA and Defense Intelligence of Ukraine began in late February 2014, so immediately upon the Ukrainian government changing. It was recently revealed in declassified documents that the CIA built 12 military bases on the front lines in Donbass, meaning America was already directly involved in the combat. The leader of the Ukrainian SBU later said these bases were the reason the Ukrainian state didn't collapse. What all this means is that Ukraine was already a total US proxy in 2014.
PaxTube completely misuses several words, which is actually pretty common in his videos. For one, the existence of any CIA base in eastern Ukraine does not mean the United States was directly involved in combat. This makes it sound like American CIA agents were shooting Russians, which was not the case. PaxTube also claims that this quote shows that Ukraine was already a total US proxy in 2014. First, total US proxy is not a real thing. That's a category with zero meaning. Second, PaxTube is so stupid. He has apparently not even Googled this article himself, instead using a screen recording from some slop channel called Cappy Nation. Believe it or not, Cappy Nation does not quote the whole article. The quote from Bakhanov follows this paragraph, which Cappy Nation did not include. The relationship is so ingrained that CIA officers remained at a remote location in western Ukraine when the Biden administration evacuated US personnel in the weeks before Russia invaded in February 2022. During the invasion, the officers relayed critical intelligence, including where Russia was planning strikes and which weapons systems they would use. Then there's the quote from Ivan Bakhanov. So this quote has zero to do with the 2014 invasion. It's about the 2022 invasion. PaxTube didn't even need to find the New York Times article himself, which is very easy to find. He could have just opened Wikipedia and looked for Ivan Bakhanov, who became the head of the Security Service of Ukraine in 2019, years after the 2014 Russian invasion. There's even juicier quotes from the actual New York Times article that would have helped PaxTube's argument, like this description of what happened soon after the 2014 revolution. The government's new spy chief, Valentin Nalivchenko, arrived at the headquarters of the Domestic Intelligence Agency and found a pile of smoldering documents in the courtyard. Inside, many of the computers had been wiped or were infected with Russian malware. It was empty. No lights, no leadership. Nobody was there, Mr. Nalivchenko said in an interview. He went to an office and called the CIA station chief and the local head of M16. It was near midnight, but he summoned them to the building, asking for help in rebuilding the agency from the ground up, and proposed a three-way partnership. That's how it all started, Mr. Nalivchenko said. So you could see PaxTube weakens his own argument because he's not smart enough to use real sources, instead taking screen caps from YouTube videos. And of course, the existence of intelligence cooperation between Ukraine and other countries does not prove Ukraine was not a sovereign country. Next, PaxTube says,
Throughout 2014 and 2015, there were various attempts at diplomatic resolutions to the conflict between Russia and the new Ukrainian government. The most important were the Minsk Accords, which were supposed to halt the fighting and give Donetsk and Luhansk more autonomy as part of Ukraine. But these agreements broke down, with both sides accusing the other of violating them. German Chancellor Angela Merkel, who helped facilitate the Minsk Accords, later stated that they were an attempt to give time to Ukraine. One could interpret these remarks to mean that Ukraine signed the Minsk Accords in bad faith.
Why is that bad faith? That's why every country signs ceasefires to buy themselves time. I suppose PaxTube is implying that Ukraine intended to violate the Minsk agreements in the future. That's not what Angela Merkel, who by the way was not in charge of Ukraine but Germany, said, considering the fact that this quote was given in 2022, after Russia invaded Ukraine again. One could very easily interpret the quote as buying time for Ukraine to build up its strength before Russia invaded again, which is a much more rational interpretation, considering the fact that Russia did invade again. Even Russian news outlets like TASS, which provide a much more full quote, show this is obviously the more correct interpretation. This is how they quote Merkel. The 2014 Minsk agreement was an attempt to buy time for Ukraine. Ukraine used this time to become stronger, as you can see today. Ukraine in 2014 to 2015 and Ukraine today are not the same. According to the ex-chancellor, it was clear for everyone that the conflict was suspended and the problem was not resolved, but it was exactly what gave Ukraine the priceless time. PaxTube says,
The new Ukrainian government escalated the conflict to new heights by repealing the neutrality clause in its constitution that declared Ukraine would not join any foreign alliances. Ukrainian officials now stated their intention to officially join NATO.
Wait. Ukraine gets blamed for escalating the conflict to new heights because Ukrainian officials said they wanted to join NATO, but Russia doesn't get any condemnation from PaxTube for invading Ukraine. Isn't that an escalation to actually invade the country? It's almost as if PaxTube doesn't even really believe his own arguments. He's not even using the best Russian talking points. He's just lazily blaming Ukraine for everything and then shrugging when Russia invades Ukraine. Also, the article he cites is from December 2014, before the second Minsk agreement. PaxTube doesn't even get the basic chronology right. Next he says,
From 2014 to 2022, the war between the ethnic Russian regions of Ukraine and the Ukrainian government continued with no end in sight. Many Ukrainians spoke out against the Maidan revolution, such as the journalist Olez Buzinya and the politician Oleg Kalashnikov. Pro-Maidan partisans on the website Miro Tvorets added dissidents like this to an online kill list where their personal information and addresses were published. As a result, they and dozens of others like them were gunned down in the street or found dead in suspicious circumstances. Even Western publications like Newsweek called for these murders to be properly investigated by Ukraine, but they never were.
Let's be a little bit more accurate here. Both of these men were not major figures. Olez Buzinya wasn't just pro-Russian, he loved Russia so much he identified as Russian despite having no Russian heritage. Oleg Kalashnikov was barely a politician. It is a mystery why he was shot, and any argument, including robbery, is possible. Even if both these men were murdered for their political views, which is possible, and it would be bad if they were, it dwarfs in comparison to the number of Ukrainians killed by Russia in the invasion of Ukraine, which PaxTube just doesn't care about. Anyways, next PaxTube talks about how the Trump administration continued the same old policy of hostility toward Russia by helping Ukraine and pulling out of an arms treaty. I think both PaxTube's claim and the contrary claim that Trump was unilaterally pro-Russia are not correct. Probably because Trump has absolutely zero consistency besides self-interest. But you know what, this is irrelevant, let's keep moving.
All in all, Trump is really no different from past American presidents. In 2019, the Rand Corporation released a paper titled Extending Russia, which plotted a plan for America to weaken Russia. One of the chief parts of this plan was to continue arming Ukraine and to brainwash Europe into opposing Russia with America. They spoke about using mass media propaganda to turn the Western world into Russian enemies. In the reports section about Ukraine, it openly states in the risks section that Ukrainians could suffer immensely from America getting further involved in the region. They are, quite frankly, cavalier about expending Ukrainian lives to accomplish their goals.
So the Rand Corporation is not the US government, and none of the anti-Ukrainian people have yet to show how the US is forcing Ukraine to do anything it doesn't want to do. People like PaxTube simultaneously believe that the US is pushing Ukraine to fight Russia, but also Ukraine is extremely hostile to Russia and wants to wipe out its Russian-speaking population. Those two things cannot be true at the same time. PaxTube says,
So by the time the 2020s rolled around, with Ukraine actively being funded and armed by the United States as they waged war on ethnic Russians, this is probably the moment Russian officials decided they would have to go to war with Ukraine. Ukraine was turning into a militarized anti-Russia battering ram, getting better armed and more dangerous every year. The New York Times confirmed this by releasing an article in 2025 detailing how since 2014, NATO military officials were directly training and arming the Ukrainian military. Finally, in February 2022, Russia entered the war directly on the side of its ethnic separatists.
Wait, that's it? That's all he has? This is a 30-minute video building up to this exact moment, and that's all PaxTube has to say about it? Okay, listen, his other videos are pretty bad, especially the one about anime, but this one, he completely dropped the ball. I can make this argument better than him. He doesn't even mention a single thing about Zelensky, at all whatsoever, and Zelensky's the president of Ukraine. He doesn't mention Russian-speaking civilian casualties. He doesn't even mention any recent things about NATO at all, nothing specific at all. How can you spend so much time on a fake promise from 1990 and how woke America is, and not even mention the president of Ukraine when Russia invaded? Okay, I will do a public service for everybody and explain why Russia invaded Ukraine again, specifically in 2022. It has to do with actually several factors, not just America being real bad. First, let's look to Russia, who is the actual actor that actually did the invading. Putin has led Russia for a generation now at this point. He's 73 years old. To put it simply, he can't wait forever. This journal article says, some observers suggest that Putin, in the run-up to the war, had lost touch with reality. Indeed, it is well known that Putin took extreme measures to isolate himself during the COVID-19 pandemic. Residing for the most part in his dacha outside of Moscow, Putin is said to have spent a lot of time reading history books and discussing history with a small circle of entrusted advisors. This, so the argument goes, reinforced Putin's belief in Ukraine's belongingness to the Russian civilization and pushed him over the edge. In case you're not sure about belongingness or whatever that means, lucky for you, Putin ranted about it for hours with Tucker Carlson. Carlson specifically made a layup for Putin by suggesting Russia invaded Ukraine because NATO. But Putin changed the subject and instead spent the entire interview talking about history, specifically how Ukraine is a fabricated nation and truly belongs to Russia. You know, like 1930s fascist stuff.
So if you don't mind, I will take only 30 seconds or 1 minute to give you a short reference to history for giving you a little historical background.
Please.
Let's look where our relationship with Ukraine started from. Where did Ukraine come from? The Russian state started gathering itself as a centralized statehood, and it is considered to be the year of the establishment of the Russian state in 862, when the townspeople of Novgorod invited a Varangian prince, Rurik, from Scandinavia to reign. In 1862, Russia celebrated the 1000th anniversary of its statehood. And in Novgorod, there is a memorial dedicated to the 1000th anniversary of the country.
If we took Putin at his word in this interview, Russia's decision to invade Ukraine had less to do with 2014 and 2004 and more to do with the 1600s. But you know what? We can also look at public statements made by Russia to explicitly explain this war. In a foreshadowing of the war, in July 2021, Vladimir Putin published an essay called On the Historical Unity of Russians and Ukrainians, which, like the later Tucker Carlson interview, explicitly said Russians and Ukrainians are one people, and made the usual sort of nationalist argument for why true sovereignty of Ukraine is possible only in partnership with Russia. Now, it's undeniable that there are plenty of historical and cultural similarities between Russians and Ukrainians. Zelensky, after all, grew up speaking Russian, but the decision over whether Ukraine should be partnered to Russia is for Ukrainians to make. The only legitimate basis for a government is the consent of the governed. Putin obviously didn't just make the cultural nationalist argument, he also listed plenty of geopolitical gripes in that essay as well. But also in December 2021, Russia proposed an agreement to ensure the security of the Russian Federation. In it, Russia proposed NATO agree not to deploy any military force or weaponry in states that were not part of NATO before May 27, 1997, which would include all the countries that joined NATO after the fall of the Soviet Union, except for East Germany, so basically all of Eastern Europe. NATO would also agree to stop expanding and abandon Ukraine. So obviously this proposal, made only months before Russia invaded Ukraine, gives us insight into what Russia's gripes were. So PaxTube is right that Russia was threatened by the expansion of NATO. Obviously, that's pretty clear. Now, of course, that doesn't mean the US should just abandon Europe, and it doesn't mean that Russia did not have agency to make its own decisions. It doesn't mean that America caused Russia to invade Ukraine. Russia made a decision on its own. That article I mentioned before proposes some other ideas why Russia decided to invade Ukraine, specifically in 2022. It says, a second group of observers hold that Russia's war against Ukraine is driven by domestic political factors and considerations. This line of argumentation comes in two varieties. One holds that the Kremlin was concerned that a democratizing Ukraine could serve as an inspiration for Russians to rise up against the Putin regime, given the geographical, cultural, and social closeness between the two countries. The second domestic politics argument is that the Kremlin decision to invade Ukraine was an attempt to deflect the Russian population's attention away from growing internal problems. In the words of Gomza, it was no surprise that after a tumultuous, albeit rigged, electoral victory in 2018 and mounting discontent over Putin's corruption, Putin looked again for popularity through military adventures abroad. Along the same lines, Ortong contends that the first source of Putin's foreign aggression against Ukraine is his deteriorating position at home. Likewise, Matovsky holds that Russia invaded Ukraine not to achieve any foreign policy objective nor grand utopian vision, but to distract the population. While Putin has obviously clung onto power despite wartime kerfuffles, like the Wagner coup, there was no guarantee he'd stay in power forever back in 2022. There's a reason why Russia murdered Alexei Navalny. There are of course factors in other countries too that evidently convinced Putin he could succeed in his invasion of Ukraine. In 2019, Volodymyr Zelensky won Ukraine's presidential election. While Zelensky has, of course, since proven himself to be a skilled wartime leader, that wasn't at all apparent back in 2019, when Zelensky was still best known for being a comedian who played a president on TV. That's like if America voted Amy Poehler or Martin Sheen for president. Everybody involved had good TV shows, but I don't think a killer like Putin would be impressed at first. According to John Bolton, Putin belittled Zelensky in a call with Donald Trump. Putin said, well, we know this guy's comedy shows on Russian television, and he's okay as a comedian, and just implying he wasn't up to the job of being president. Bolton tells a similar but less extreme version of events in his memoir. Anyways, nothing much came of Zelensky's talks between Ukraine and Russia, and in 2020, Ukraine published a new national security strategy that made the country's strongest statement yet of its aspirations to join NATO. Acquisition of full membership in the European Union and the North Atlantic Treaty Organization is the strategic course of the state. Obviously, Putin did not like that. Now, there were other things going on as well. If you remember, the US was, and still is, in a moment of political instability. Russia definitely made note of January 6th. Russia also made note of the disordered US retreat from Afghanistan. A Reuters article quotes Nikolai Patrushev, the head of Russia's Security Council, as saying, was the ousted pro-American regime in Kabul saved by the fact that Afghanistan had the status of a principal US ally outside NATO? The answer to that is no. A similar situation awaits supporters of the American choice in Ukraine. So it's clear there was a confluence of many factors that drove Russia to build up its army in 2021 and invade Ukraine in 2022. Ultimately, the decision was Russia's. Here's what PaxTube says next.
This began the conflict that makes headlines today. As the conflict escalated, NATO countries responded by getting rid of any ambiguity that they were with Ukraine and fully backed it as a proxy against Russia. America alone, under genocide Joe Biden, sent over $300 billion worth of weapons. It's been declassified that the post-Maidan Ukrainian state was fully dependent on the US militarily and economically. This means that despite the Russia-Ukraine war being framed as a war over sovereignty, Ukraine never had sovereignty to begin with.
If Ukraine is not a sovereign country but only a puppet of the United States, then why is Zelensky pushing back at all against Trump's proposals for a peace plan? Just because Ukraine relied on American support to survive the beginning of the war does not mean Ukraine is not and was not a sovereign state, and it doesn't mean the war wasn't about sovereignty either. Anyways, PaxTube's conclusion is just him restating his arguments. The war was caused by America, Europe has to rise up, Ukraine sucks, that sort of thing, which I've addressed before in this video. But you know what, I finished writing the script at midnight, now it's 1 a.m. for me, so let's just end it here. If you like this video and want to see a sequel, like, subscribe, share, and check out patreon.com/whatwhyhow. For $1 a month you can support the channel and keep everything alive. Thanks to those who already do, and adios.